Good evening. Thank you everyone for coming out on such a rainy evening, although for me at least it being kind of dark and rainy feels very appropriate for Sagarra. I feel like it gets us into the bajos fondos right from the start. I will clarify that I'm unfortunately not Miriam Basilio, who was scheduled to be our moderator for this evening. And unfortunately, she's not feeling well, so we're going to do our best without her charismatic charm. I will say that she's very sorry not to make it, and I do have some comments and a question that she sent ahead for me to ask after I introduce our panel of really wonderful speakers for this evening. First, certainly you're all familiar with the fact that Josep Maria Muñoz has been accompanying us this semester as our King Juan Carlos chair, and it has been a true luxury to have him amongst us. I was very fortunate to work with Marianne Newman to nominate Josep Maria to come to campus, and we were very grateful for the KJC for accepting our suggestion, and we've really been so enlightened in many different ways by having him here on campus. And I have to say that this event is bittersweet for me personally because it marks the last of his public presentations, and it just makes me realize all the more how much we're going to miss his presence on campus. Really, it's just been phenomenal to have him here. I very much hope that it is the start of a longer-term interaction that we can have as scholars with him even while he is across the Atlantic. For those of you who are unfamiliar with Josep Maria, well, I doubt there are any in the room who that may be the case, I will just summarize for you briefly that we have with us tonight a really acclaimed historian who is foremost, in my mind, really representative of a prolonged engagement with the humanities and thinking about ways to not only dig deep historically in terms of Catalan intellectual life, but also finding ways to really make visible to a wider readership the intellectual stakes around the humanities through his directorship of La Vents, which is really the leading Catalan cultural magazine that I know, for one, I have been a fan of since I was a wee graduate student, right? Too long ago, but I have in my bookshelf still early issues that La Vents put out, really reconstructing both historical legacies, but also really blazing new ground in terms of this idea of a prolonged conversation. And I do feel like our semester has given us a window into the value that has as an academic community to engage with someone who is so vitally connected with issues of the present, but also framed historically. Also joining us tonight is Margarita Casacuberta, who I have fondly suggested may in the future return as one of our chairs. There's a complot now. We'll see if we can, we have to give it a cooling period, but then hopefully we can revisit it. Mita has really brought with her and Josep stay here a really beautiful enthusiasm for intellectual inquiry, and I know that she's been buried in her own projects and has been less visible in terms of our, we fantasize about socializing at the beginning of these chair periods, but I know that she has also benefited deeply from being here for the semester, and we really look forward to reading about all that she has been researching. For those of you who aren't familiar with Mita's work, she is a very highly regarded specialist in Catalan literature who herself has really been trailblazing in terms of uncovering other kinds of legacies and thinking about poetry, literature. Foremost among the subjects that she has researched is Santiago Rusiñol, who I always joke to my students is, depending on what discipline you're sitting on, either known as a painter or a playwright or a poet. But for those of us who straddle, it's remarkable that one of the foremost figures she works on was a discipline breaker. So I really appreciate that about her work. And she also is a translator herself of among others, the work of Émile Zola. And to mention just briefly that she has really lit up the kind of attention to poetry through this Festival Mo, right, the word festival in Girona, which is again another example of how Josep Maria and Mita are kind of like the dynamic duo for putting ideas that sometimes belong to very specialized precincts at the attention of a much greater public, which is really thematically what our focus has been this year on kind of bringing intellectual ideas out to the public. And I'll also, most of you will know Marianne Newman, who is really the centerpiece of our conversation tonight because of a really remarkable translation that she did of Josep Maria de Sagarra's Private Lives. And for all of us who have been able to read that book, we are the recipients of her very prolonged engagement with not only Sagarra, but Catalan literature and culture throughout decades. And I feel like it's a really kind of beautiful occasion to celebrate not only this specific book, but also, I would say, for many of us, Marianne's pivotal role in introducing us to really the amazing fortunes that are Catalan literature and culture. Personally, I learned Catalan from Marianne. I can't say I was her best student, but I have hope.
You were grand.
I was grand, yes, I was grand. I'm dogged. I follow her around persistently. But among other things, I would just highlight the fact that she is currently the executive director of the Farragut Fund for Catalan Culture in the U.S., which is already making really remarkable strides for bringing attention to Catalan culture here in New York specifically, but also, the United States, outside of New York City as well. And there are a few very recent signals of that achievement that I would just mention. One is the fact that Marianne was just less than weeks ago named to the Advisory Council of the Public Diplomacy Council of Catalonia, a really remarkable assemblage of people, personalities whose charge is to bring attention to Catalan culture worldwide, and we're really fortunate that one of our very own has been named to this council, a remarkable privilege. But also, she has just been named the 30th year, the 30th.
I don't know.
The 30th, it's the occasion, excuse me, I'm going to bungle this. The 30th International J.B. Sendros Prize given by Omnion for the work that she has done specifically in building bridges between Barcelona and New York since the 1980s, but also for her work in the diffusion of Catalan culture and specifically her work for translating Catalan literature into English. And that award will be bestowed upon her on the 16th of December. Mm-hmm. So she's jetting out of here to receive that award. Mm-hmm. And finally, just in terms of her longer relationship with NYU, for us here at NYU, Marianne has always been an esteemed colleague who for several years ran a remarkable place on campus, which was the Catalan Center, which I personally am very much sorry that institutionally we don't have anymore, but we're fortunate that Marianne has maintained her affiliation with NYU. She's always generous in raising scholars to our attention and is really a beloved member of the NYU community at large, beyond the walls of the KJC, and has a great impact among our students and faculty because of her multiple affiliations on campus. So before we begin our conversation, which is really going to be far-reaching, I just wanted to draw attention to Miriam's comments about the book, since Miriam, along with myself, is really indebted to this group of individuals for all the work that they do on Catalan culture. And Miriam, in her reflections on Marianne's translation, but also on really what Sagarra does in Private Lives, wrote about her experience reading the book, quote, "You are drawn into a web of social relations across time, urban spaces, and often assumed identities. You see families branching out through the city and events that seem innocuous becoming dramatic turning points in some of these people's stories. The people are from varied social strata, but Sagarra moves the reader through the spaces of the city to evoke how lives intersect in complex and surprising ways. He also conveys the period's social conventions in vivid ways so that you can appreciate the many transgressions taking place throughout the story." And this is really one of the more remarkable things about Sagarra's book and Marianne's translation is her capacity through the translation to bring this historic language to life. Because as you read Sagarra in translation, we encounter once again the particular texture of that language from the period, which is really quite a task, right? And one of the questions that Miriam asked that I'll kind of launch into the air, and you can take up, or maybe now or later in the conversation. And she asked specifically about if you could think of how is it, or could you draw parallels or traces of the city's life now, especially the social hierarchies or institutions, with the ones that Sagarra described so vividly. And I think at the core of Miriam's question is about how much of what Sagarra tells us about Barcelona and its complexities still resonates today, or is the city so transformed through the kind of globalization processes that I would say we have all witnessed that those traces are no longer visible. So please help me welcome the three of our esteemed colleagues for tonight's discussion, and we look forward to hearing from you.
Thank you, Jordana, so much for this presentation. Thank you, all of you, for coming in spite of the heavy rain and the Spanish flu and all these things. Well, this is, in effect, this is the last public event I am organizing as a fall 2016 chair here at the King Juan Carlos Center. Therefore, it's also an opportunity to show publicly my gratitude for having had this unique opportunity of becoming part of such a stimulating academic institution, community. I am old enough to have learned that you cannot live inside a bubble forever. And sooner or later, you have to return to reality, to everyday life. But I also know that I shall return home after an enriching experience and a growing infatuation with this lovely city. Well, when we were discussing with Anna and Jordana the program of my stay here at King Juan Carlos, we agreed that it would be interesting to dedicate this last event to the literary image of my hometown, Barcelona. Immediately, we were aware that one of the most important novels about Barcelona, Vida Privada, by Josep Maria de Sagarra, had been recently translated into English, and that it was a magnificent opportunity to talk about it. Today, we can do this with two highly qualified guests. Mita Casacuberta, with whom I share my apartment in the village, and a mortgage in Barcelona, among other extraordinary things, as well as our best friend in New York, Marianne Newman, who has so nicely translated the book and whose work in favor of Catalan culture has received the double and well-deserved recognition in Barcelona. So let's talk about this wonderful book. If you Google novels on Barcelona, you can easily find a list of 10 published in the past 80 years, including Nada by Carmen Laforet, La Plaça del Diamant, The Time of the Doves, by Mercè Rodoreda, Últimas Tardes con Teresa, by Juan Mercè, Los Mares del Sur, Southern Seas, or maybe Tatuaje, Tattoo, by Manuel Vázquez Montalbán, La Ciudad de los Prodigios, The City of Marvels, by Eduardo Mendoza, and fortunately or not, the list ends, among other minor books, with the bestsellers appeared in the new century, La Sombra del Viento, The Shadow of the Wind, by Carlos Ruiz Zafón, or La Catedral del Mar, Cathedral of the Sea, by Ildefonso Falcones. But unquestionably, the one on the top of any possible list is Vida Privada, Private Life, published in 1932 by Josep Maria de Sagarra, that you can, as I was saying, that you can now read in English, thanks to a magnificent translation by Marianne Newman that has been published by this inspiring publishing house named Archipelago Books. Apart from its undeniable literary merits, which I hope we will discuss later, I would like to speak of its historical singularity. I would like to stress briefly 2 points. In the first place, private life can be rightly considered the first great novel of Barcelona, a city that had not had its Balzac, its Dickens, its Zola, although Narcís Oller tried to do something along the lines of the French author, nor its Proust. The reasons for that can be discussed in many ways, but I would like to remember that in 1925, a writer by the name of Victor Català attended a public lecture given by another Catalan writer, Carlos Riba. In his lecture, titled A Generation Without Novel, this well-known poet and critic defended the primacy of poetry in the recovery of Catalan as a literary language. The next day, Catherine Albert, who was the writer using the Victor Català pseudonym, wrote a letter to Riba's wife, the poet Clementine Arderiu. Full of common sense, she told her, I quote, I believed that the major cause for such a small number of novels written nowadays was simply the lack of generous publishers. As you know, publishers are always guilty. To write a novel requires prolonged time and effort. Literary writers do not, as the popular saying goes, leash dogs with sausages.
Tie dogs with sausages,
Yeah, meaning they cannot afford many luxuries.
Yes, yes.
After stating that the majority of writers cannot live upon their work, she showed herself convinced that when a writer could earn a living from his or her books, as the doctor earns a living from his practice or the lawyer from his office, novelists should arise spontaneously, full of vital prodigality. And she added, your husband, a wise critic, searches for deeper roots to explain this anemia. He's probably right, but I would like, can I say that? He was wrong, so the remedy would be closer. Both Riba's lecture and Victor Català's seemingly naive comment were part of a lively debate about the novel that, as Alan Yates aptly summed it up, contains the first serious, sustained public approach to the issue of professionalization of Catalan literature. And finally, this so arrived in the promising years of the Republican spring, opened by the proclamation of the Spanish Republic in April 14, 1931. Josep Pla, himself a member of this generation of writers with novel, wrote that private life is a social chronicle of excellent adjectival, a malicious, well-thought book full of interest, a book of unquestionable European normalcy. This leads me to my second point. This is a European book, as long as Barcelona had become, in the 30s, one of the most prominent European cities. Pierre Vilar, in The Age of Don Quixote, one of his few essays translated into English, stated that masterpieces have a date, and also that every masterpiece distills for us a full draught of concrete history. Thus, he said, Don Quixote, this universal book, this eternal book, is first and foremost a Spanish book of 1605. It only gathers its full meaning in its true historical setting. Saving all distances, which are a lot, a similar thing can be said of Private Life, a novel which amazingly documents the passage from the old city to the new, from the old elites to the new, from the old politics to the new, from the artisan to the industrial city. Let's see a few images of such a transformation. as historian Jordi Nadal note, Barcelona is the only city in the Mediterranean that has experienced two great revolutions, the commercial revolution of the Middle Ages and the industrial revolution of the 19th century. The first 30 years of the 20th century will see the enormous growth of the city. Barcelona will see how both the physical layout and the social and political unrest growth with the growing demands of both the working class and the Catalan nationalism. Barcelona in these years doubles its population from 500,000 to 1 million in less than 30 years. It was a city in expansion. At the middle of 19th century, in 1859, was approved the plan of extension of the city, and the old city lived the former walls, which were demolished, and build this wonderful Eixample, establishing a clear distinction between the old city with the perimeter of the walls, of the former walls, and the new network, the new grid,
Oh, yeah, great.
the new grid of Amsterdam. This is where the novel happens, where it takes place. These two walls are very.
But the contrast between Tia Paulina's Barcelona. There are the characters who live inside the walls, and then, the rest of the characters for whom the city has expanded. And Sagarra uses that to make that a point.
Of course, the most important event in these years, previous to the publication of the book, is the International Exposition, showing this new strength of the city, allowing the urbanization of a concrete sector of the city, the Montjuic mountain, and trying to be a manifestation of this new city. Full of modernity, with these lights which have been compared to asparagus and maybe to other less talkable things, and incorporating European modernity, not too much. Jordana,
A souvenir.
it's like a souvenir,
Yes.
but I like very much this picture, because you can see the German pavilion by Mies van der Rohe, built in 1929 and rebuilt on the occasion of the Olympic Games. And then at the end, the modernist factory, Fábrica Casa Ramona, by Josep Puig Cadafalch, built 20 years before, in 1910 or 12, I can't remember. It's a city full of, with the first problems created by cars. For instance, the first in 1910, a license was given for the first 21st for the 21st first vehicles, first taxis in the city, and in 1920, 10 years later, there were already 1,000 taxis. In 1931, the distinctive yellow and black color was established. So this was a change also in the cultural and the educational panorama of the city, with a growing attention to culture, to books. There is this nice picture by Gabriel Casas.
St. Jordi Day is invented by the booksellers It used to be like a Valentine's Day because St. George killed the dragon to save the damsel, blah, blah, blah. And the bookseller said, and so lovers would give each other a rose, or probably the man would give the woman a rose. And in 1932, the bookseller said, oh, let's turn that into a celebration of books. And then it became the man gives the woman a rose, the woman gives the man a book. Nowadays, of course, it's not gendered. But it's amazing that such a beautiful holiday had such a strictly commercial origin.
This probably, you can probably read it, is the list of the books published in October 1932, which is when the vida privada appeared. So you can read the list, but it's an interesting list, and it's part of this idea of growing attention to culture. Well, this is a photo of Sagarra. It's 20 years later, after the publication of Private Life. But I like very much this amazing photo by Català Roca. And well, I don't want to speak more because it has a lot of things to tell us. But the idea, my whole idea is that for the very first time, there exists a public, an audience for such a novel, and this transformation of the city in the 30s allowed, for the first time, there was the conditions for such literature, for such a novel, were created in this European city that Barcelona was in the 30s. Thank you.
Thank you very much for inviting me and for the kind introduction of Jordana. Once again, I am Margarida Casgoberta, and I would talk about Private Life and the great novel of Barcelona, one of the most persistent debates in the history of contemporary Catalan literature. What do we mean when we say the great novel of Barcelona? For a long time, especially during the 20s and 30s, the lament of the critics for the lack of the great novel of Barcelona almost became commonplace in Catalonia. It was one of the major shortcomings of Catalan literature, since the novel was established as the defining genre of modernity and progress in modern cities. A metonymy of the abnormality, retrogradism, or provincialism of a literature, those same critics dared to ask Catalan writers to undertake the great novel of Barcelona. Having become a cliché that unfortunately lasted many years, finally in 1997, the great novel of Barcelona was published. Generalissimo Francisco Franco was still dead. Do you remember Chevy Chase? And democracy in Spain was regained after more than 20 years. The moment was particularly favorable for Catalan literature. Maybe that's why the much-awaited great novel of Barcelona was not a novel, but the title of a book of short stories written by Sergi Pàmies, who was tired of always hearing the same song. It must be said that, at that time, Barcelona had become fashionable, and the city had also become the stage of all kinds of novels, especially bestsellers. It is a pity that Pàmies' book has not yet been translated into English. I will take this opportunity to encourage Marianne Newman to do so. It is a book written from the distant outlook of a 21st century narrator, self-conscious and ironical. In the novel, Barcelona is not a real city, but a cliché or literary construct. So, in the book, the great novel of Barcelona is only the title of the last of its 15 brief stories, each under 30 pages long, built on a play on words and the confusion between the literal and figurative senses of sobre Barcelona. In Catalan, the English words above and about can be conveyed by the same word, sobre. The expression refers to the point of view of the narrator, an airplane pilot about to land at Barcelona's airport and therefore literally above Barcelona. In any case, the irony running throughout Sergi Pàmies' book also indicates the recognition of a significant problem of both literary tradition and Catalan culture. Josep Maria de Sagarra directly experienced this problem, and it informs the very writing of Private Life. So, why was Barcelona missing its 19th century quintessential novel? The great novel of Barcelona, like the great novels of Paris, London, Lisbon, or New York, should have been written in the mid-19th century, when the great European capitals were being constructed in the economic and socio-political sense, as well as developing in terms of their cultural and symbolic importance. At the time, Barcelona was the economic capital of a centralist state that had failed to impose Madrid as the capital of all the territories that make up the complex fabric of Spain. It is not strange then that realist novels in the Spanish literary tradition do not focus on the Villa de Madrid, town of Madrid, until the end of the 19th century. Moreover, both the Madrid of Galdós and the Vetusta Oviedo of Clarín are far away from the Paris of Balzac, Stendhal, and Zola, and the London of Dickens, Austen, or Eliot. So, what about Barcelona, the most modern city in 19th century Spain? With regard to Barcelona, a realistic novel about the transformation of the modern city does not appear until the late 19th century, with The Gold Rush by the Catalan writer Narcís Oller. I think it's the first novel about Barcelona. So, the first great novel about Barcelona then was not written in Spanish, but in Catalan. Before Oller, the literary image of Barcelona was cultivated by capturing the characteristics, customs, celebrations, and places of entertainment, as well as the vanishing urban reality in romancistic narratives. Above all, however, throughout the 19th century, it was poetry that built the image of Barcelona. The result was an idealized image of the city that had little to do with reality, but still persists today. There is a historical explanation for this. In 1859, when the medieval walls of Barcelona were being pulled down and new plans for city expansion were in motion, a poetry competition known as the Floral Games of Barcelona began. The competition was modeled after a medieval poetry tournament and given a motto: fatherland, faith, and love, that served to further the idealist themes of the literature of the time. Through this filter, a more friendly and balanced view of the modern city was constructed. I find it interesting to note this coincidence. While art and literature perpetuated this idealistic imagery of Barcelona, the city was gaining a reputation internationally as the factory of Spain, the new Babylon, and the city of bombs. Thus, at this moment of peak modernization, when Barcelona was suffering from the tensions that persist with modern life, industrialization, immigration, cosmopolitanism, social and identity conflicts, political repression, is paradoxically when the literary image of the city appeared in literature in its most ideal form. Focused from an elevated viewpoint, usually atop one of the hills surrounding the city with the sea facing her, or a narrative constructed from nostalgia and memories, Barcelona is humanized, specifically feminized, and became golden. And since she became a woman, also became a liar. Behind the mask lie the conflict, anxiety, and vulnerability of the modern city. The image which Pamia's story opens with, then, is not at all innocent. Instead of climbing a mountain, the narrator is in a plane. Here is a quote from this scene. Seen from the airplane, the city is an extension of geometric forms in perfect symphony. If one concentrates a little, one can see the movement of cars, vans, buses, and trucks. The whole exudes a calm which does not match reality and which allows the passengers flying over it to come away with a mistaken idea. The city, however, is not golden, like the image of it appears in the poems from the Floral Games. Here, it is described as grey, due to the amorphous mass crawling through the streets of the city like a swarm of insects when seen from an airplane or a mountain. From this perspective, the great novel of Barcelona is nothing more than a label, an anachronistic cliché that persists today, a result of the inferiority complex of a culture convinced that, as Eugeni d'Ors wrote in a famous essay, at the moment that definitively marked the history of modern Europe, we were not there. An inferiority complex and a compensatory longing form an important part of the history of the great novel of Barcelona, one of the names of the persistent debate about the construction of a culture and the symbolic materials of which it is comprised, that Catalonia contended with. Finally, how did private life become the great novel of Barcelona? We have to place the writing of private life at the center of this debate surrounding the construction of a culture. The author, Josep Maria de Sagarra i de Castellarnau, born in Barcelona in 1894, it has been said, was a poet, journalist, playwright, and translator. He wrote and published his first novel, Paulina Buxareu, in 1919, in the context of the Catalan political and cultural movement called noucentisme, which started in 1906 and ended in 1923. The project was part of the institutionalization of Catalan culture promoted by the Mancomunitat of Catalonia, the first democratic attempt in the early 20th century to decentralize Spanish politics and promote autonomy in Catalonia. But this also meant that intellectuals committed to that political and cultural project were faithful to the conservative ideas of the political party that led the movement. As a consequence, art and literature actively contributed to the creation of the ideal Catalonia, and so did Josep Maria de Sagarra's first novel. The collapse that represented the First World War, and in Spain, the military coup and the dictatorship of General Primo de Rivera between 1923 and 1930 closed the doors to both the incipient political autonomy and the institutionalization of Catalan culture. Having lost the institutional support, but also the ideological and aesthetic restrictions, Catalan writers had to return to the public at large and accept the roles of the modern literary market. What the public asked for was not poetry, nor idealistic narrative, but a novel, the modern and realistic genre par excellence. Sagarra did not hesitate to join the voices opposing the cultural policy of noucentisme and considered Barcelona to be the most fertile ground to write the kind of novels that the public was asking for. Like many others, Sagarra knew the success that the novels about Barcelona's underworld enjoyed abroad. Thus, Sagarra became one of the main opponents of the ideas of noucentisme and, at the same time, one of the main proponents of the recovery of the realistic roots of the novel as a literary genre. This is why Sagarra began to ask Catalan writers to write novels of all the genres, and also implored them to explore the bowels of Barcelona through his articles. One of these articles is titled "The Fear of the Novel" and was published in the Catalan progressive newspaper La Publicitat on April 26, 1925. Another is titled "The Smell of the Novel" and appeared in the Catalan weekly Mirador on May 5, 1932. In the first article, Sagarra asks for legible novels that were accessible and palatable for the general reading public. Readable novels that were accessible and palatable for the general reading public. In the second article, Sagarra himself claimed to have lost his fear of the novel because he announced that he began to feel the smell of the novel when he stopped to contemplate the souls of the people he met and the air and the stone of the city that had seen his birth. Sagarra concludes, "I believe that our social and political history as people from Catalonia and Barcelona deserve a real novel. I do not know who will write this novel. For my part, making use of that shamelessness of which I spoke before, I can say that I started to write something with the intent to be a novel. After a few months, Private Life was published and won the Creixells Award in 1932. The novel caused a considerable scandal because the shamelessness confessed by the author had moved to the narrator, and therefore the novel had become a complex and intimate portrait of Catalan society, especially the city of Barcelona, who is Private Life's main character. In Private Life, as the title of this roundtable suggests, Sagarra explores the depths of Barcelona at one of the most crucial moments in the history of contemporary Spain. The passage from the dictatorship of General Primo de Rivera to the proclamation of the Second Republic certainly represented a huge political change. Sagarra, however, endeavors to show that nothing will change through an omniscient narrator who allows all licenses and focuses on the most cynical character in the novel, one who shares both aristocratic origins and the project of writing a novel about Barcelona with the author. Behind the mask of the Golden City, there is always the same rotten society, from high society to low-life society, decadent aristocrats, frivolous, bourgeois, dishonest intellectuals, and corrupt politicians. The only thing that the narrative does not criticize is this quality of Barcelonisme that some characters in the novel possess. This is a kind of moral value that balances and reacts to the conservative old regime and the modern customs and aesthetics of Barcelona. It is difficult to describe. On the threshold of the Second Republic, the evocative depictions of the builders of a mid-19th century industrial and commercial Barcelona are for Sagarra the essence of what was on the verge of disappearing. The district of La Ribera in the old city, with both the streets of Moncada and Mercaders, meaning lords and merchants, respectively, before the new boulevard, which was modeled after Chicago, divided in two parts. Sagarra was born there, as was the most positive character in his novel, Pilar Romaní, one of the last members of the old Catalan aristocracy who was based in that commercial district. At the end of Private Life, Pilar Romaní passes away, and her son, Bobby, began a Proustian walk through the old Barcelona, allowing him to recover the memory of his mother and the memory of the city, which he associated with one another. After all the crap that the narrator of Private Life revealed, what remains unshakable beyond death is their authenticity, the intangible quality called Barcelonisme. Thank you very much.
It's funny because Eugeni d'Ors coincides with Victor Català, which is something you wouldn't think of immediately because Eugeni d'Ors is such a dandy, and this neoclassic. and Victor Català is much more earthy.
Yes.
No, but she says, well, there wouldn't be a novel there would be lots of novels if there were any money attached to them. And Eugenie Dors says about the floral games, because they used to give an eglantinador, the prize for the floral games was a jewel. And Ors at a certain point said, stop with the jewels already, we need some money to be attached to these things. So, no?
Yes.
Yeah.
Exactly.
And the Premi Creixells is very funny. Josep Maria sent us an article today by Gaziel, where he's laughing at the Premi Creixells because they named it after this young man who died too young. But the Creixells is the award that allows people to write novels. No, so Sagarra writes Private Life in 2 months at the Athenaeum, the Barcelona Athenaeum. And it took me 6 months of full-time work to translate it. But it's funny because from what you were saying, the conflict between the novel, and the United States was also concerned to write the great American novel at the turn of the century. Yeah. So the first conflict is novel versus poetry. And then the thing about Sergi Pàmies, the other joke about Sergi Pàmies writing the great Barcelona novel, is that he and Quim Monzó were extraordinary practitioners of the genre of the short story, and everybody was constantly asking them, when are you going to write a novel? When are you going to write a novel? So he wrote the novel as a bunch of short stories, but it was that. Exactly. That's the humor in that. The interesting thing about Private Life and the European normalcy, I think you said the norm you were talking about, is that Private Life is not, when it's the novel that is written when nobody imagines that the Civil War is going to break out. So it's sort of the last sign of the Barcelona that could have been. So I think that's an interesting thing for people to bear in mind because, from then on, everything becomes the Civil War novel or the post-Civil War novel. I'm going to do a broadside on translation before we actually read, because that's what I do. No, that's okay.
A friend of mine, a historian, is always saying that we use in Spain when we talking to students to say the Republic and Civil War, 1931, 1939, and then Franco years, beginning in 1939. He's proposing to change the chronology and begin Francoism in 1936 and not to associate the Civil War to the Republic, as this chronology is doing.
Yes. Yeah, very, very nice. So, I wanted to suggest that translation studies are poised to address the challenges scholars face when negotiating sites of memory. And I would like to ask how translation can be mobilized in the construction of an alternative canon. What are the implications of this with regard to cultural memory? And I think Private Life is a case of, first of all, an alternative canon, even in the sense we just said, and certainly a repository of cultural memory, because one of the things Sagarra does is to telescope time. He takes you from the Universal Exposition to the Republic in five incredibly dense pages. And he also can take you back and forth between the sort of 18th century or 19th century cotillions and the 20th century wastrels. So in the course of maybe 2 sentences. So anyway, it's one of the incredibly rich things of this book, because you're constantly time traveling. But translation may be the principal motor behind the construction of an alternative canon. In 1986, I translated my first book, a collection of short stories by Quim Monzó, then a young Catalan writer. everything went swimmingly. The cover even included a blurb that said, Catalan culture is one of the world's richest. It has given us the art of Dalí, Cavalier, Miró, Gaudí, and Casals. Now it gives us Muñoz and his astonishing fabulism. Even nowadays, it's hard to imagine a blurb like that. And it's not a blurb, it's actually the publisher's description of the book on the cover. But when the time came for the book to be reviewed, instead of sending it to an expert in contemporary short story of any origin, it was sent to someone who was an expert in Spanish literature. And that poor reviewer had no idea what to do with it. He called Muñoz a surrealist and compared him to Garcia Lorca, which is just crazy. So, fast forward to today. In just the past 5 years, with the support of the Institut Ramon Llull, over 20 20th century Catalan novels and short stories have been translated. The absolute classics of Catalan literature, Caterino Albert, I think there wasn't any funding for that, they just did it out of love. Mercè Rodoreda, Josep Pla, Joan Sales, Francesc Trabal, Salvador Espriu, and I recommend them all to you. They're amazing novels and novelists. An unimaginable richness of contemporary texts. It would be conceivable to offer a full course in fiction and poetry of the 20th and early 21st century in English translation, or to introduce Catalan text into survey courses in 20th century literature. The books exist, but there is still no consolidated literary apparatus to review them. We are at a much richer standstill, but a standstill just the same. So beyond the task of the translator, there is the nitty-gritty of the market and the place of academics. A colleague from Notre Dame, how do we say that? Leonardo Francalanci, who did his PhD at the University of Girona, uses private life in his course on reading the city, Barcelona in cinema and literature. And I think Miriam Basilio and Jordana Mendelsohn also assigned the book here. But the barrier to a concerted knowledge on the part of the English language reading public seems unsurmountable. Translation, thank God, is becoming a hot topic, but people take one from column A, Edgar Carret of Israel, one from column B, Elsa Ferrante, add a little African spice, Nyong'o, and if we are lucky, they discover Mercè Rodoreda. Clearly, this is not just a problem of Catalan literature, but it is more of a problem for Catalan literature. Now, as for cultural memory, as long as the books are in print or in the cloud, there is potential for cultural memory. What is necessary is the will. So, what kinds of cultural artifacts is translation able to preserve, and how does it preserve them? Are there limits to cultural translation? Can something simply not be translated? I am an optimist. I think everything that is knowable can be transmitted, with some remainders and with some things left behind. And everything we know about another culture or another person, or even about ourselves, we know through translation. Of translation, in our case, of the inchoate sentiment into words. I love the way a Turkish translator, Aron Aji, explains the shortcomings of mere vocabulary in this way. What Turkish may lack in lexical breadth, its vocabulary is only a fifth of the English. It compensates amply in semiotic depth. What may seem like unsettling ambiguity in English is often part of the elusive poetic substance of Turkish. When successful, I'd like my English translation not only to convey the translatable in a satisfying manner, but also gesture toward and give the reader a distinct sense of the untranslatable. In A Long Day's Evening, it was particularly satisfying to render Bilge Karazu's impossible phrase, and I'm not going to try to pronounce it, as being ever near, yet never ever there. Translators then are faced with a double dilemma. To take an example from English and Romance languages, English has dozens of synonyms for walking, to stride, to saunter, to amble, to plod, to dawdle, to hike, to trudge, to trod. At some point before the automobile, we must have walked a lot. It is very difficult to convey these specificities in a second language. This must usually be achieved by attaching adjectives and adverbs, for example, to caminar. But at least one has a sense what adverb to use. The problem for an English translator into English is when you have the word caminar, do you just translate it as walk? Or do you try to convey the weight of the character, the nature of the character, the landscape they're walking through. Which of those many ways of saying to walk do you use? Okay. Anyway, this is adding something to the always lamented losses of translation. Conversely, and more in keeping with the dilemma of the Turkish writer, what is a translator into English to do with the incredibly useful and ineffably poetic word esma, which is my absolutely favorite expression in Catalan, desma. Noting esma, the ferro is, I don't feel like doing it. Esma is kind of oomph. I don't, no, I don't have the energy to do it, noting esma. And if you do something desma, it means you do it sort of automatically, sort of without realizing. It's just so beautiful. Anyway, so I often found myself facing these dilemmas in private life. For example, Sagarra has 2 catchphrases that are repeated throughout the book. People are divided into the epidermic and the estomacal. Epidermic sometimes means superficial. Other times it means subtle. And estomacal can mean gut level, as in a gut feeling, or full-bellied, like people who don't have any problems, or driven by the need to eat, as so many of the marginal characters in his book are. As a translator, I found myself first having to realize that the words did not always mean the same thing, and they most certainly could not be rendered as stomach and epidermis, and then intuit which of these meanings was the most apposite to the meaning in the scene. Private life poses and to some extent answers all of these questions. Josep Maria de Sagarra often, this is one of the beautiful things about the book, is that he uses every sense. He uses, and I mean, it's incredibly visual, but it's also incredibly tactile, etc. He's essential. He often evokes a particular period or social class by the simple accumulation of objects. He is a sensualist. For example, when the Jubarola family, who are the aristocrats at the center of the novel, move from their big mansion in the old town to a probably a big enough apartment in the city, in the Champla, but they have all of their old mansion furniture crowded into these smaller rooms, and you just feel the oppressive presence of the furniture, and anyway, so Sagarra tells the story through the objects also. So he's a sensualist who uses all of his senses, and NYU is interfering. I keep getting a screen. Sight, sound, touch, smell, and taste to tell his story. You'll see this in the first reading, where a man wakes up in a dark room. His sight awakens little by little, and we discover with him where he is. He feels the pain of a hangover. He remembers the night before by running his fingers over the initials on the pillow he is sleeping on. He smells the stale smells. He feels the dampness on the pillow. He tastes the cigarette. Only in the opening pages, every human sense is engaged. So, unfortunately, I have some work being done in my house, and my many copies of Vida Privada. No, I have it in English, but I don't have it in Catalan. So we wanted to do a bilingual reading, and it's going to have to be in monolingual reading, I'm sorry. His eyelids opened with an almost imperceptible click, as if they had been sealed shut by earlier contact with tears and smoke, or by the emotions that come from reading too long under a dim light. As his pupils struggled to make something out, he rubbed his eyelashes. He flicked at them rapidly, using the pinky finger of his right hand much like a comb. All he could see was a vague panorama of limp, watery shadows, the kind of scene a man blinded by daylight might perceive on entering an aquarium. Against this murky background, a long vaporous blade the color of crushed oranges on the piers came increasingly into focus. It was a beam of light stealing through the slats of the shutters, only to sour in the dense atmosphere of the room. It must have been about 4:30 in the afternoon. Frederic de Jubarola, the man with the aching eyelids, had awakened on his own. No one had called him. No sounds had startled him. His nerves had had their fill of sleep. They had sapped to the dregs a colorless, absurd dream, the kind that leaves hardly a trace when you awaken. The kind you have when nothing is going on in your life. Frederic spent no more than 8 seconds surfacing into reality. On the worn tile floor lay items of his clothing, embarrassed at their own disorder, entangled with chiffon stockings and a woman's deflated and frankly dirty cotton knit nightgown. All 4 chairs were piled with her things. The little vanity was weighted down with miniature bottles, powder cases, tweezers, and scissors, and the open armoire resembled a funeral procession. The dresses and coats on the hangers, lively with bright colors and appliques, brought to mind a series of 2 thin carnival princesses who had been decapitated and pierced through the trachea with a hook. Atop the armoire rested empty, dust-coated hat boxes, keeping company with a stuffed dog. The dog had been entrusted to an inept taxidermist who had stuffed it deplorably, leaving all the stitches visible between the hairs on its moth-eaten belly. His mistress had adorned the dog's neck with an old-fashioned garter from which 3 minuscule roses peeped out, like 3 drops of blood. Frederic began to notice the smells in the close chamber. One single odor of spent tobacco dominated like a bitter medicine. The trapped smoke impregnated the sheets and Frederic's skin, mingling with traces of a store-bought cologne and all the vapors produced in the abandon of 2 bodies, which the night maliciously stores up to proffer mercilessly when the storm has passed and sleep has placed a wall of incomprehension between a somnolence of expectant contacts and a livid, skeptical, and unaroused awakening. To combat the assault of the odors outside and the bad taste inside his mouth, Frederic stretched out his arm and picked up his cigarette lighter and a Camel from the night table. Only 2 draws were necessary. The experiment with a fresh cigarette was fruitless. Frederic ran his fingers over the pink fabric of the pillow that lay beside his own, a slightly damp fabric impregnated with smelly oils. His fingers lingered over the fabric, reposing dumbly, his fingernails scratching out a faint sound on the relief of the embroidered initials. R, T, R, T. Ah, yes, Rosa Trenor. His lips said the name softly, repeating it mechanically. A little grease, a little dampness remained behind on her pillow, along with the hollow of her head. But anything she might have left behind of her dreams had already died a cold death. Frozen, perhaps poisoned, by the smoke and breath of this man, Frederic, alone in bed since she had closed the door, sleeping his brutal, inconsiderate, insatiable sleep, turbulent with hydrochloric acid. I'm going to go on to the next. Anyway, you see all the smells, tastes. So the next piece is the chouclas, and this is an interesting. Sagarra also portrays really every estamen, every level of society, and he speaks in passing, but he talks about the people who've made their money from slaving, which is something that doesn't come up usually in literature, and he has Jewish characters prominently featured in the book. 152, sorry. Okay. The chouclas were descended from Jews. Bobby's ancestors had goat's hair beards and thin, dirty, mercantile fingernails, and lived in the Barcelona neighborhood that nowadays is still known as the Call, the ghetto. But even in the 18th century, these Barcelonans were also already considered honorable and somewhat ennobled people, and they infused blood of the highest quality into their matrimonial alliances. Bobby's father had been one of the most elegant roués of Barcelona. Still, instead of squandering his inheritance, he had derived great profit from the last ties to the colonies. He was on good terms with the Comillases, the Arnuses, and the Gironas, and with all the other households that in those days held the purse strings of commerce. He was also a shrewd and diligent man, a man of the world with an eye for the fine print. As a result, he held a solid and extremely brilliant position in society, which continued only to expand and to grow in prestige. In old Chouclas' personality, the banker, the voracious shark, varnished with a generous flexibility, stood side by side with the gallant ladies' man. The art of the elder Chocolat lay in knowing how to have his cake and eat it, in such a way that his adventures and scandals never put his business at risk, and could be seen by his friends with amusement, and sometimes even with admiration. His widow was considered by some to have been a victim. This is the character that Mita talked about, Pilar Rumani. Poor Pilar, was the plaint, because all her wealth and elegance could not compensate for her husband's having shown up every month with a new acquisition extracted from the demi-monde, whom he would materially smother in pearls. Nor did they compensate for the famous banker's long sojourns in Vienna, during which, under the cover of business, he sowed the wild oats of his temperament between a gypsy violin and a rose of Bulgaria. Old Chocolat had imbibed the entire epic of the waltz and the square sideburn. This is why, when he was in Paris, his heart yearned for Vienna, because the women there were taller, whiter, blonder, more animal, with easier laughter and more primal sexuality. Above all, they had a more docile and lyrical flesh, accustomed as they were to being brutalized by the shiny despotism of military officers and the hands of country bumpkins. In truth, poor Pilar couldn't have cared less about all this. She had never loved her husband, and it was far more pleasant to have at her side a pompous spiritual philanderer who lavished all manner of attentions on her, than to be saddled with the reactionary Tomás de Lloberola, brimming with uncomprehending egoism, who between processions and intonations of the Tres Sanctus would have given her a horrible life. A friend of ours said to me, well, what are you going to do in the States? I mean, with this horrible portrait of Jewish people, and I thought, well, what you have to take into account is these are the best people in the book. The old man Chocolat, whose first name we never learned, and Bobby Chocolat, and Pilar Rumani. They are, they're the salt of the earth. But you have to be able to read through the sort of period depiction of the people. Okay, when the book moves to part 2, this is where we go in 5 pages. I'm not going to read all 5 pages. From the Universal Exhibition to the Republic. And but it's such beautiful language that I'm going to start with the Universal Exhibition. The Barreau de Falset is a character who got his barony by building convents. So the real aristocrats who have no money look down on him, even though he has a lot of money, and basically, what? It's page 267. But you have to read it because the Guillem de Lloberola pushes him into suicide, basically. So it had been 5 years since the Barreau de Falset drilled a bullet into his head. In those 5 years, the public life of the country had undergone quite an evolution. Events of glorious transcendence had taken place in Barcelona. The most brilliant moments were marked by the 1929 Exposition Universal in Montjuic. The entire parade of souls the reader had occasion to contemplate one night at a party thrown by Hortensia Portel. That was a party where Primo de Rivera showed up, and it's a fabulous scene. I just couldn't read the whole book. Completed the final lap of its peacock promenade. Firecrackers burst from their eyes and streamers flowed from their mouths. The summer of 1929 was a season of phosphorescence. The most lacquered chassis, the most pearlescent yachts, festooned with the most profuse bunting, combined to dazzle all the bootblacks from Almeria who bent to their trade at the foot of the Rambla around the monument to Columbus and on the sidewalk cafes of the Plaza de Catalunya. Cabarets once again exuded chilled champagne as in the good old days of World War I. Barcelona's hotels were overwhelmed. Anyone with an extra cot or a room ordinarily devoted to fleas had a cannon from Extremadura or a fishmonger from Portbou as a boarder. Some even went so far as to lay mattresses on the rooftops and use the lightning rods for hangers. Barcelona was bubbling in a stew of grandeur, and it was every man for himself. Eyes, cheeks, noses, and sexes found infinite room to play. Nocturnal parties during the exhibition were truly a dream, a prodigious sight that horrified the people of Barcelona. "Where will the millions come to pay for such extravagance?" said the man on the street, carrying a child in each arm and a little dog sticking out of his vest pocket. These all look like cartoons. I'm convinced that he was describing cartoons. But anyway, sometimes I've actually managed to find the pictures that he is evoking in the book, but I haven't found these. And it's the man on the street who will have to pony up so that all the blue, green, and pink mystery of the colored fountains of the Palau Nacional can rain down Ballet Russe, St. Lorenzo's tears, and other worldly foam onto his necktie. I'm not going to. There's a fun part. At closing time, the Ramblas and the cabarets were packed to the gills. At the end of the day, the American fleet would spew out a stream of giant toy sailors dressed like children who would gorge themselves on sweet sherry and the high-octane alcohol known as aguardén. Sweet sherry, later toppling onto benches or carrying women around on piggyback. Then a squad of some kind of officers, spiffy and loose-limbed as a Charleston, would beat them down with billy clubs and pile them into a big old wagon. When they reached the Puerta de la Pau, they would toss them into the launches and the sailors would tumble in with a plop, like bales of wet cotton. I just love that part. Well, I'll just do the emergence of the Republic, and I won't read the last pages, which Mita spoke about. Barcelona shimmered like an international shooting star. Wait, I'm sorry. In the publicity published abroad about the exposition, the financial fiddling of the magnates of the situation swelled to cosmic proportions. Anyone who didn't brazenly steal simply didn't have fingers, poor thing. When it was over, people cringed, wondering how such things could have been tolerated. But the fact that they put up with it and accepted it was very natural. Politicians know that there is nothing so mutable, so easy to fool, so corruptible as a mob. And in those days, Barcelona, Catalonia, and Spain were just that, a great mob of small intestines and rubberneckers. The dictatorship filled shriveled stomachs with crusts of bread and offered up a bit of fireworks to cast a reflex of red happiness on their curious faces. Cowardice and stupidity on all sides contributed to the game, and yet it cannot be denied that Barcelona did have a brilliant, stupendously decorative moment. But this happiness was not to last. Stocks began to wobble, currency began to wobble, and the dictator was tired, and everyone was tired of the dictator. The king gave him a kick in the belly with the cold geological cruelty that is the province of kings. As Primo de Rivera had the good fortune to die a dull and decent death in Paris, no one asked for his head. In a word, it was a blunt, primary, and not at all perverse sort of biology. One fine day, people woke up to find the Republic in the streets. People seized onto the Republic in childlike amazement without bloodshed or vengeance. The Conde de Romanones went to the Escorial to send the Queen off. The Count sat on a wooden bench at the tram station with his mustache, his twisted hat, and his desolately historic eyes. Not far from his shoe stood an empty bottle of Sinalco, the oldest soft drink in Europe. In those days, in El Escorial, they still drank Sinalco. The Queen left Spain like a lady-in-waiting wearing a necklace of tears. No one dared steal even a petal of the disintegrating roses she held in a large, pallid, and misty bouquet, watered with the sobs of the aristocracy. Okay. You can see, I mean, just feel the brilliance of Barcelona, right? I mean, the depth.
Like a few minutes of questions before we
Anyway.
Hi, my name is Contessa Bourbon from the New York Times. I'd like to ask, what's the most stunning moment in the book? How do you describe the style of the author? Is he poetic or he just used precise language?
The most stunning moment in the book, according to a friend of ours, Perico Pastor, who is this incredible sadomasochistic sex scene. But I think the most stunning moment in the book is a perfect crime. There's a perfect murder that can't be, that just goes absolutely unknown. I don't know if it's poetic. It's rich. It's more. I don't know. You've heard it. Does it sound poetic?
The end is poetic.
The end is very poetic. Which is what we haven't read. But you can get the book out of the library or buy it. I mean, I hope this makes you want to read it. So.
How old was he after when you wrote it?
He was born in 1894, and it was 1932. So he was about 40, 38. I think he was younger.
32.
Yeah. Anyway, but in his 30s, 38. Mm-hmm.
I have a question about the city and this, because we're now in a time where we are rethinking cities again, and it goes with a kind of a crisis of agency of what can we do, what do we do, what have we done, a sort of capacity or lack of capacity to act on these kind of collective environs that we're seeing revisited now. I think with the smart city initiatives and a kind of a post-industrial rethinking of this city and Barcelona, because I'd argue that Barcelona is the best city at remaking itself, at kind of presenting itself, being industrial, and then in this case it was the
Universal Exposition.
Yeah, the Universal. But then the Olympics most recently, which is the paradigmatic transformation.
The first one was 1888. I mean, 1888. There was a Universal Exposition, 1929, and then the Olympics.
Right. So this kind of capacity to what extent was the author involved in? Is the city just a backdrop for the characters, or is it really an analysis of what the city makes? Whether or not we are made by a city or the city makes, we make the city. I mean, what that sort of sense of place and culture.
Probably, as Mita said, the city is the main character in the book. Huh? Mm-hmm. In a way, he's disenchanted view of the city. He's viewing from this old city, and I think in a way he's rather skeptical also about the modernization of the city. He's taking part in this. He's a modern man in a way, but I think there is some kind of...
Well, he does have that sort of Lampedusan, everything changes so that nothing changes. Mm. Though that goes to Miriam's question that Jordana asked. Has there been a break between this sort of eternal Barcelona that, and now with the modern, I don't know.
But of course the capacity of creating consensus that the city of the 90s with the Olympics game has had was not there in the 30s. It was a much more conflicting city than the city we know.
Sorry, one thing only. I think Josep Maria de Sagarra is an anti-modernist, so his point of view is from the anti-modern, and this is why at the end of the novel is Barcelonism what is the best value in the novel, and it's set in the old city, so in what is disappearing. So I don't know.
Yeah, the characters in the city are inseparable, really, and Barcelonism is what dies with the mother of Babi Shukla. Yes. She's the last repository of this. He also does that with smell, because the smell that she and Hortensia Portel share is the smell of, I think, camellias and the mustache wax. and the smell of the young modern people is motor oil and aftershave, basically. So, anyway.
So that's a fascinating observation, because I was trying to think as a comparatist, right? How do you, so if you wrote a piece for public books, right? I was thinking, why not write a piece of public books about these new translations, right? To let people know that they're there. Public Books is a site that public culture started. And so what's the comparative context? And I'm thinking there are times when in hearing you, I think of Benjamin, but I also think of Fitzgerald. Yes. I think of Roberto Arlt, right? Imagining Buenos Aires, right? The kind of, and I wonder how you as wide readers, right, of kind of the novels of that moment, and the writing of that moment, how do you map him for people, not the, Catalan, Henry James or something, but how do you locate him in terms of that kind of global imaginary of like modernity? Because it's about something that's being lost. It's not only a kind of modernism that it's not exactly a nostalgia, right? It's more like Benjamin's residue.
I don't think it's a nostalgia. I think, I don't think he wants to go back. He's very, very modern also. He just is aesthetically is sad at the loss of, at the kind of ugliness and lack of elegance of but one of the things I think is interesting is that happens in Catalan literature is that it gets smushed, it gets compressed, so that he's doing everybody. He's doing a little bit of Stendhal, and he's also, and it's sort of a compendium of styles, I think. Would you say?
Well, I think he's trying to write the great novel of the 19th century. So I think it's a kind of a mixture between the 19th century novel and he tries to write like Proust. But it's a mixture of styles and also point of view from, and the narrator is an omniscient narrator. It's not a modernist narrator, it's an 18th century narrator.
Mm-hmm. And intrusive too.
Yes, of course, yes.
But it's funny because what is called modernismo in a sense, the noucentistas invent modernismo, because it also is a compression of romanticism, pre-Raphaelitism, etc. I mean, they're all of the symbolism, all of the 19th century movements are compressed into 20 years in Catalonia. So I think the same thing happens with private life.
And also, for example, Cuba is in this novel. Because one of the main characters has a big relationship with Cuba, so it's yes, it's global with Catalonia or Barcelona in the center of his point of view. Yes. Mm-hmm.
I think this is a bit of a follow-up on Anna's question. I was thinking on the question of peripheral modernities and the role of Catalonia.
Of what?
Peripheral modernities. And the fact that in a funny way, these are sort of quintessentially comparative projects, because the sort of the cultural density that there seems to be a demand for cultural density that is of a piece with this belief in the aesthetic as the value that will kind of legitimize these cultures. So what I think is really interesting, and that sort of goes with the reading that you did of the idealization of Barcelona, is that there is in Catalan literature, and I think Pere Privada is a good example of this, there's a sort of a tendency to aestheticize everything. that I think sort of needs to be spoken
As
about.
Unamuno said.
Just to put it very, very simply, but there is a sort of an obsession with cultural capital, an obsession with the production of aesthetic value that seems to compensate for something else. And I think it would be kind of it would be nice if you could speak a little bit about that, because you basically, all of you have touched up on it a little bit. So, and I think it goes together with the question of, this sort of comparative understanding of literary literary minor literatures or peripheral modernities.
I'm not sure Sagarra aestheticizes, though. Do you? I mean, I really don't think he does. Do you? Okay. But I would say it's language more than style, but I mean, and I think it's very concrete, but it's interesting. Of course, I mean, the drive to aestheticize in Catalonia is well documented. But I don't know. I don't feel it in Sagarra. But do you? No.
I would invite everyone to continue the conversation outside, and also please joining me in thanking our speakers for today.